Good evening, and welcome again to our broadcast, The Old Testament is About You. I have a note that I want to answer. Someone wrote to me and told me that they had recently seen a broadcast and followed through by reading a book, in which it says that the Exodus never took place, Moses never existed, and the story of Genesis Exodus was written 1,000 years after or so, after these events were supposed to have taken place, maybe 700 or 800 years later actually, and that all of the miracles in the Exodus were actually simply natural events and happened just naturally. Now, there's an interesting internal contradiction in this, though. Supposing the Exodus had not taken place and somebody in 700 BC had written the book of Genesis Exodus, or perhaps all 5 books of Moses, and the miracles that took place were simply natural events. Well, of course, some of them were. But let's ask ourselves, if the Jews were never down there on the southern tip of Sinai, off the sort of beaten path or track area, how did they know about these events that take place naturally down there? How did they know about the lakes of black water, the bitter waters of Mara? How did they know about the quail migration, where the quail in fact do land at a certain part of Sinai, and they're very easy to trap? And how would that writer in 700 BC, well, most of Israel was in an awkward state, and how would they have known where these springs were? The spring at the foot of Mount Sinai, for example, the description of Mount Sinai, and all these other things that take place, if they hadn't been there. So somebody 700 years later who had not been in that part of Sinai, because almost no one was ever in that part of Sinai, a few desert tribes wandered around here and there. But how would they have known all these details so finely, in such correct detail, if they hadn't been there? So obviously, whoever wrote the book of Exodus was there in these places and described them firsthand. So, of course, the quail migration takes place naturally, and the manna falls from the trees naturally. Nevertheless, God brought the Israelites to that place where they could be sustained and carry through. But had Moses not been there and the Jews not come, or the Hebrews not come through that area at that time, somebody writing in 700 years later wouldn't have had a clue where these places are or these natural events that took place. So the story could only have come from people who are actually there, actually at each of these places, had described them accurately, and had written from first-hand experience. So this is one of the problems with speculations. People who have some reason, or think they have some reason, to oppose the essence of the scripture can determine or make up any idea or concept that they want to try to use in opposition to the scripture. The details of scripture are not all completely accurate. We know that. The description of the journey through Sinai is accurate, and the places, the bitter waters, the springs, Rephidim, all these places are there just exactly as they're described. This was written from first-hand knowledge by somebody who was in all of these places under those circumstances. So these random criticism, ideological criticisms of Scripture probably shouldn't be paid a great deal of attention to. It's something that we will discuss as we go along, is some of the anachronisms and things that occur here and there in Scripture, and we will discuss those as we come to them. Because we need to give a little bit of a historical setting. But now let's turn to the way the Hebrews behaved during the Exodus and compare that with the people who write these fanciful theories against the Scripture, or to criticize the accuracy of the Scripture in ways that are inappropriate. The Hebrews, when they faced difficult times, difficult moments, lost sight of what was ahead, and even lost sight of why they were where they were. And instead of wanting to continue the ascent toward that which was promised and given, they decided that they would just as soon turn back into their bondage, because at least they'd have something to fill their bellies with. And it was easy enough for them to betray Moses and to betray their God when they were unsure or in fear, or when they thought that the path was too difficult. Now, very often, people who like to attack the Scripture, there are some valid criticisms here and there. As I say, we'll discuss those. But people who like to attack the Scripture and make these, what to me are outrageous critiques or criticisms, are often those people who have become bitter and angry for some reason. Perhaps because of passions which aren't fulfilled or can't be fulfilled. Perhaps they feel that they didn't get what they wanted in life, or something. Anyway, they have this kind of bitterness that they want to turn and attack the Scripture. Often, though, it's because in accepting the Scripture, certain obligations and certain constraints are placed upon us. I don't mean the constraints and obligations of the Old Testament law. God forbid. We've been liberated from that by Jesus Christ. But the teachings of Jesus Christ himself, beautiful, humane, compassionate as they are, place obligations and restrictions upon our behavior, obligations upon our personal life and behavior, if we accept those and say that we believe them. So sometimes people simply want to be free of these obligations and constraints. And so they want to undermine the source of those obligations and constraints. Not even stopping to think that if we look carefully at the obligations that Christ places upon us, they consist primarily in love and compassion and reaching out to other human beings who need us. This is one of the great obligations that's placed upon us as Christians. And it's something that has, through the existence of Christianity over these centuries, so permeated our society that it becomes ingrained in people even if they're not Christians. But there are also certain constraints placed upon us, and those constraints are there to deliver us from grief, sorrow, troubles, illnesses, and other catastrophes. We're not delivered from all of them, but anyway, we escape from very many of these human catastrophes if we were to follow the teachings of Jesus Christ. And yet so many people want to undermine that teaching some way, undermine the authority behind it, really because they do not like these constraints. Of course, a part of the problem is in fundamentalists who want to legislate their doctrines and dogmas through civil law and enforce them upon everyone. And frankly, we Orthodox Christians would be very unhappy if we were under a